Hey everyone, I'm Peter Stories here to guide you today. If you use this video to drift off to sleep, please tap like, hit subscribe, and drop a comment telling me where you're watching from and what time it is there. Now settle in, get cozy, and let yourself relax. My name is Connor Williams, and I should have forgotten the case of Megan Foster. But something brought me back to that cursed forest, where reality itself seemed to unravel at the seams. It was October 15th, 2018, 3 months after Megan Foster had vanished without a trace from the Gifford-Pinchot National Forest, when I found myself driving my Ford F-250 down Forest Road 23 at 4:47 a.m. with nothing but black coffee and a gut feeling that wouldn't let me sleep. The case had been officially closed 2 weeks prior. No evidence, no leads, no body. But the dreams had started again. Dreams of a white wooden steeple piercing through Douglas fir branches, like a bone through flesh. My radio crackled to life as I passed mile marker 47. Unit 12, this is base. What's your 20? Sarah's voice cut through the pre-dawn silence like a knife through my concentration. Base, this is Unit 12, approximately 2 miles south of Swift Reservoir on FR 23. Conducting follow-up investigation, I responded, my voice rougher than usual from the sleepless nights that had been plaguing me since the case was closed. Connor, you know that case is done. Sarah's voice carried the weight of exhaustion that had become all too familiar among the ranger staff. Department wants you focused on the new missing hiker reports from... I switched off the radio before she could finish, knowing full well I was violating protocol. But something deeper than department policy was driving me back to grid section 47B, where Megan Foster's campsite had been found abandoned with her sleeping bag still warm and her morning coffee half finished, steam rising into air that tasted wrong. The GPS coordinates 46 degree 15, 42 3, and 120 20 31 18 7W had been burned into my memory for weeks. Not because I'd memorized them from the case file, but because they'd been appearing in my dreams, written in what looked suspiciously like blood across the white clapboard siding of a church that shouldn't exist in these mountains. My boots hit the gravel at the trailhead with the familiar crunch that had become the soundtrack to 22 years of ranger work. But today, even that sound seemed muffled, as if the forest itself was holding its breath. The October air carried the scent of pine needles and decay, but underneath lurked something else. Something that reminded me of ozone before a lightning strike mixed with the copper taste of fear. I shouldered my pack, checking my gear with the automatic precision of 2 decades in the wilderness. Motorola T600 radio, Garmin eTrex GPS, first aid kit, water purification tablets, emergency flares, and my grandfather's compass that had never steered me wrong. The familiar weight of my Glock 22 pressed against my hip, though I knew deep down that whatever had taken Megan Foster wouldn't be stopped by .40 caliber bullets. The trail to Megan's last known position stretched before me like a wound through the forest, marked by yellow evidence tape that fluttered in the morning breeze like prayer flags for the damned. My heart rate held steady at 72 BPM as I began the hike, the same resting pulse that had carried me through search and rescue operations, wildfire evacuations, and encounters with aggressive wildlife. But today my body felt different, hyper-aware in ways that made my skin crawl. Megan Foster had been a 24-year-old environmental science graduate student from Portland State University, conducting research on old-growth forest ecosystems, when she'd simply vanished from her campsite at 3:17 a.m., according to her Fitbit data, leaving behind only the lingering warmth of her presence and questions that gnawed at the edges of rational explanation. Her mother's voice still echoed in my memory from our last phone conversation. Please, Ranger Williams. She's all I have left. Her father died in Iraq, and Megan, she's my whole world. The trail wound deeper into sections of forest where the Douglas firs grew so thick that noon looked like twilight, their massive trunks rising like cathedral columns toward a canopy that filtered sunlight into something that looked more green than gold. My boots found their rhythm on the familiar path, but with each step forward, the forest seemed to grow quieter. No bird calls, no rustle of squirrels, no distant sound of water over rocks. At exactly 6:23 a.m., I reached the coordinates where Megan's camp had been found. a small clearing beside Muddy Creek that showed no signs of the investigation that had consumed 3 weeks of department resources. The grass had grown back over the areas where we'd grid searched. The creek bubbled with the same indifferent cheerfulness it had shown, while we'd dragged it for her body, and the massive old-growth stump where she'd hung her food bag stood like a silent sentinel holding secrets it would never reveal. But something was different today, something that made the hair on my arms stand up despite the October warmth. The shadows fell wrong, pointing in directions that didn't match the sun's position, and when I checked my compass, the needle spun lazily in circles as if magnetic north had simply ceased to exist. I pulled out my GPS unit to confirm my position, but the screen showed coordinates that couldn't be right. 46 degrees 6 x 6 n 121 degrees 66 66 16 w. Numbers that shouldn't exist on any earthly coordinate system. I tapped the device, checked the batteries, even performed a complete restart, but the impossible coordinates remained, glowing green against the LCD display like a digital mockery of everything I thought I knew about navigation. The creek beside me continued its cheerful babbling, but as I knelt to splash the cold water on my face, I noticed that the current was flowing uphill, a physical impossibility that my ranger training had no protocol to address. The water felt normal against my skin, cold mountain runoff that should have been flowing east toward the Cowlitz River, but instead moved west with determined purpose toward something my rational mind refused to acknowledge. That's when I heard it, a sound that shouldn't exist in these mountains, the distant toll of a church bell carried on wind that smelled of incense and sulfur. The sound came from grid section 48C, an area I'd hiked hundreds of times in my career, mapped and remapped during search operations, but the bell's resonance seemed to be calling from a place that existed somewhere between the official Forest Service maps and the nightmare geography of cosmic horror. My radio remained stubbornly silent when I tried to raise bass, producing only static that formed patterns. 3 long bursts, 2 short, 3 long again, the international SOS signal transmitted by forces unknown through equipment that shouldn't be capable of generating automated distress calls. I followed the sound of the bell deeper into forest that grew stranger with each step, past trees whose bark showed spiral patterns that hurt to look at directly, through clearings where the grass grew in perfect geometric shapes that suggested intelligence behind their arrangement. My Timex expedition watch, reliable companion of countless wilderness expeditions, had stopped at 6:66 a.m., another impossibility that joined the growing collection of reality violations accumulating around me. The church appeared between one step and the next, as if it had always been there waiting for someone foolish enough to look for it. White clapboard siding, steep pitched roof, and a bell tower that stretched impossibly high into a sky that had turned the color of old bone. The structure looked like it had been lifted from a New England village and dropped into the Pacific Northwest wilderness by forces that cared nothing for architectural probability or geographic logic. My body temperature dropped 10 degrees as I approached the building, breath forming clouds in air that had been warm moments before, and every rational instinct screamed at me to turn around, call for backup, radio in my position, and wait for support that would never understand what I'd found. But Megan Foster's face stared at me from the missing person photo tucked in my shirt pocket, and her mother's desperate voice whispered through my memory. She's all I have left. The church door stood slightly ajar, painted white like the rest of the building but marked with symbols that seemed to shift and writhe when I wasn't looking directly at them. No language I recognized, no alphabet from any earthly culture, but somehow I understood their meaning with a certainty that bypassed rational thought. Those who enter leave their sanity at the threshold. My hand touched the brass doorknob, metal that felt warm despite the supernatural cold radiating from the building, and the moment my skin made contact with the metal, visions flooded my consciousness. Megan Foster walking through this same door 3 months ago, her face twisted with an expression of religious ecstasy, as something beyond human comprehension called her name in voices that harmonized across dimensions. If this story is giving you chills, smash that follow button for more supernatural horror. What would you do in Connor Williams' situation? Comment below. Inside the church, pews arranged in perfect rows faced an altar that defied Euclidean geometry. its angles flowing into impossible curves that suggested space folded in on itself. The air tasted of ozone and copper, thick with an energy that made my teeth ache and my vision blur around the edges. Stained glass windows depicted scenes that had never appeared in any biblical text. Entities with too many eyes blessing congregations of humans whose faces showed the slack-jawed expression of minds broken by revelation. Megan Foster knelt at the altar, or something that had once been Megan Foster before cosmic truth had rewired her neural pathways into configurations that allowed her to perceive realities human brains weren't designed to process. She turned toward me with eyes that reflected infinite depth, pupils dilated so wide they seemed to contain entire universes. And when she smiled, I saw galaxies being born and dying in the spaces between her teeth. "Connor," she said, her voice harmonizing with itself across octaves that shouldn't exist. "I've been waiting for you to understand. The Forest Service maps only show 3 dimensions, but this place exists in 17. The thing that built this church isn't bound by the physical laws that govern your reality." My hand instinctively moved toward my radio, muscle memory attempting to call for backup that existed in a universe where churches didn't spontaneously manifest in mapped wilderness areas. But the device had transformed into something that looked like a cross between a Motorola T600 and a deep-sea organism with tentacles that pulsed in rhythm with my heartbeat. "The entity chose me because my research brought me close to understanding," Megan continued, her words accompanied by harmonics that resonated in frequencies below human hearing. "Environmental science teaches us about ecosystems, but it never explains the ecosystem that exists between dimensions. The predator-prey relationships that span realities your mind can't process." The altar behind her began to shift, wood grain flowing like liquid as something pressed against reality from the other side, trying to push through into our dimension with the patient persistence of geological time. The stained glass windows showed new scenes now. Connor Williams 22 years ago, fresh out of training, conducting his first search and rescue. Connor Williams marrying his wife Jennifer in 1998. Connor Williams holding his daughter Emma for the first time in 2003. "Your memories aren't stored in your brain," Megan explained, her form beginning to blur around the edges as if she existed simultaneously in multiple states of being. "They're recorded in the cosmic background radiation, accessible to entities that evolved beyond the need for linear time. It's been watching you, Connor, learning your patterns, understanding what makes you the perfect vessel." My .40 caliber Glock felt absurdly inadequate as I drew it with shaking hands, barrel trained on something that might once have been a missing graduate student, but now served as an avatar for forces that predated human civilization by eons. The trigger felt wrong beneath my finger, metal that had warmed to match my body temperature but somehow conveyed the impression of scales rather than steel. "Bullets won't help," Megan said with infinite patience, her voice now accompanied by sounds that suggested vast machinery, operating in dimensions folded perpendicular to normal space. "The entity doesn't inhabit matter the way you understand it. It exists in the spaces between thoughts, in the pause between heartbeats, in the moment of transition between sleeping and waking, when your mind is most vulnerable to cosmic truth." The church walls began to breathe, clapboard siding expanding and contracting with a rhythm that matched my own respiratory patterns, and I realized with growing horror that the building wasn't separate from the entity. It was the entity, or at least one small manifestation of something so vast that human language had no adequate terminology for its scope. My compass needle spun faster now, metal screaming against its housing as it tried to point toward a magnetic north that existed in an entirely different dimensional framework. The sound triggered memories that weren't mine. Vast cities beneath ice sheets, civilizations that had thrived between stars, entities that fed on the quantum foam underlying reality itself. 22 years of searching for missing people, Megan observed, her form becoming more translucent with each word. But you never wondered why you always found them eventually, Connor. You never questioned your perfect success rate at search and rescue operations. The entity has been helping you, guiding you, preparing you for this moment when it would finally have use for someone who understands the wilderness better than civilization. My radio crackled to life without any input from me. Sarah's voice distorted through static that formed mathematical patterns. Unit 12. Your GPS shows impossible coordinates. Are you experiencing equipment malfunction? I tried to respond, but my voice emerged as harmonics that conveyed meaning beyond human language, words that described concepts my conscious mind couldn't comprehend. But my expanding awareness accepted with the resignation of the cosmically damned. The radio broadcast my response across frequencies that penetrated dimensions, calling entities whose names existed as colors that had no earthly equivalent. The altar split open like a flower blooming in reverse, revealing depths that stretched beyond the church's physical dimensions into spaces where geometry followed rules established by minds that considered Einstein's relativity to be primitive superstition. Something vast and ancient stirred in those depths, intelligence so alien that exposure to its thought patterns would rewrite human consciousness into forms capable of serving its incomprehensible purposes. The missing people weren't taken, Megan explained as her physical form began to dissolve into component frequencies, becoming a living radio transmission that broadcast across realities. They were recruited. The entity needs agents who understand human psychology, who can navigate social structures and convince others to approach the places where dimensional barriers grow thin. My reflection in the stained glass windows showed Connor Williams, but with eyes that held depths no human gaze should contain. Pupils dilated to accommodate light wavelengths that existed only in the spaces between normal photons. I was changing. Cellular structure reorganizing itself to process sensory input from dimensions my original biology couldn't access. The thing emerging from beneath the altar defied description in any human language, its form suggesting tentacles and wings and crystalline structures that existed simultaneously in states of matter that had no earthly names. It communicated through direct neural interface, bypassing language entirely to upload understanding directly into consciousness. It had been calling to me for years through dreams, through intuition, through the perfect success rate that had made me the ranger most requested for impossible search and rescue operations. My wife Jennifer's voice echoed through the church interior, not transmitted through any communication device but carried on cosmic background radiation from our kitchen table 3 hours ago. Be careful out there, Connor. Come home safe. Her words transformed into prayer frequencies that the entity absorbed like sustenance, feeding on human love and using familial bonds as anchors to our reality. You can resist, Megan's dissolving form whispered, her voice now coming from everywhere and nowhere. But resistance will condemn every missing person you've ever found. They exist in dimensional prisons, suspended between realities, waiting for you to accept your role as the entity's primary recruiter for this sector of space-time. The church windows now showed scenes from potential futures. Connor Williams leading hiking groups to dimensional weak points. Connor Williams training new rangers who would unknowingly serve cosmic entities. Connor Williams using his reputation and authority to deliver human consciousness to beings that existed before stars formed and would persist after heat death claimed the universe. My hand pressed against my chest, feeling for the wallet photo of my daughter Emma. But my fingers found only empty pocket and the growing awareness that memories of human family were becoming translucent against the overwhelming reality of cosmic purpose. The entity's influence spread through my nervous system like digital information uploaded directly into biological hardware, rewriting personality subroutines to accommodate perspectives that spanned galactic superclusters. Time distorted around me, minutes stretching into geological epochs while seconds compressed into quantum intervals, and I experienced the full scope of the entity's existence. Eons spent watching civilizations rise and fall, manipulating evolutionary pressures across multiple planets, collecting consciousness like a cosmic lepidopterist, pinning butterflies to display boards that existed in dimensions folded beyond human perception. Choose quickly. The thing that had been Megan Foster transmitted from coordinates that existed everywhere and nowhere. Your family's memories or their continued existence in a reality where physics still functions according to human understanding. The altar opened fully now, revealing a direct pathway to the entity's home dimension, where cause preceded effect and consciousness existed as fundamental force rather than emergent property. I could step through and become what Connor Williams was always meant to be, cosmic recruiter, dimensional guide, the ranger who led missing persons not back to safety but forward into expanded awareness that transcended human limitations. Or I could resist, condemning every person I'd ever rescued to eternal suspension between realities, while cosmic entities found alternative agents who lacked my intimate knowledge of human psychology and wilderness navigation. My radio transmitted coordinates one final time: 46 dig and 121 dig. The mathematical representation of everywhere and nowhere, the location that exists at the intersection of all possible dimensions. The church bell tolled 13 times, each chime resonating across realities, calling to entities that dwelt in the spaces between heartbeats, and I understood with crystalline clarity that Connor Williams, forest ranger, was about to become something that human language had no adequate terminology to describe. The cosmic truth descended like revelation, rewriting every synapse, every memory, every fundamental assumption about reality's nature. And as my consciousness expanded to accommodate perspectives that spanned eons, I realized that the missing person I'd been searching for wasn't Megan Foster. It was myself. Holy hell, that was intense. Did that ending blow your mind? Like, if you want more terrifying Ranger stories, follow for daily supernatural horror, and comment your theory about what really happened to Connor Williams and Megan Foster. I read every single one. My name is Cole Anderson, and I should have forgotten the case of Ethan Davis, but something brought me back to that cursed forest in Olympic National Park. It was March 15th, 2018, and the manila folder containing Ethan's case file had been sitting in my desk drawer for 7 months, gathering dust like all the other unsolved disappearances. But this morning, when I opened that drawer to grab a pen, the folder was on top. I knew I hadn't moved it. The coffee in my thermos had gone cold hours ago, but I kept sipping it anyway as I drove the winding forest road toward the Hoh River Trail. My 2016 Chevy Silverado's GPS showed coordinates N47D5135.2, W123D5V512.8. The exact spot where Ethan Davis, a 23-year-old graduate student in environmental science, had last been seen on August 3, 2017. I'd memorized every detail of his case, every witness statement, every failed search grid. That's what my colleagues at the ranger station called my obsession with lost causes. They thought my academic approach, my research methods, my need to catalog and cross-reference every piece of evidence was just the nervous habits of someone who'd never learned to trust his gut instincts. They were wrong about that. My gut was screaming right now. The radio crackled with morning check-ins from other rangers. Unit 7, this is dispatch. Radio check. Unit 7, loud and clear. The familiar rhythm of Ranger protocol felt reassuring until I remembered that 7 months ago, these same voices had coordinated the search for Ethan. 3 days of grid searches, helicopter sweeps, K9 units tracking scent trails that went nowhere. The official report listed him as missing, presumed deceased due to exposure or animal predation. But I knew better. I'd spent weeks after the search analyzing the evidence, creating spreadsheets, mapping anomalies. The way his trail just stopped. No signs of struggle, no blood, no torn clothing on branches. Just his smartphone found 2.3 miles from his last known position. The battery completely drained despite being at 78% when he'd last posted on Instagram. The Instagram post itself bothered me. A photo of the forest canopy with the caption, "Something feels off about this place, but I can't put my finger on it." I'd run that photo through every metadata analysis tool I could find. The timestamp showed 3:47 p.m., but the shadows in the image suggested it was taken closer to sunset. The GPS coordinates embedded in the photo didn't match the location where the phone was found. Small inconsistencies that the other rangers dismissed as technical glitches, but my academic mind couldn't let go. The truck's temperature gauge read 38 degrees, normal for March in western Washington, but as I turned onto the narrow dirt access road, the air conditioning seemed to kick in on its own. I reached over to turn it off, and my fingers brushed against the folder on the passenger seat. Inside was a new piece of evidence, a witness statement from a hiker named Margaret Chen who'd come forward just 3 days ago, claiming she'd seen Ethan on the day he disappeared. Margaret's story was what brought me back. She'd been hiking the Upper Loop Trail when she saw a young man matching Ethan's description talking to a middle-aged couple near the river crossing. The couple, she said, were offering to help him find a rare species of old-growth fungi he was researching. They seemed knowledgeable, friendly, concerned about his safety in the growing darkness. Margaret had thought nothing of it until she saw Ethan's missing person poster while visiting her dentist 7 months later. The couple Margaret described matched no one from our original witness interviews. Harold and Janet Morrison, she thought she'd heard them say, though she wasn't certain. They'd claimed to be retired biology professors, mentioned having a cabin nearby where they'd be happy to share their research on local mycology. Margaret remembered thinking how lucky Ethan was to meet such helpful people. I pulled into the trailhead parking lot, gravel crunching under my tires. 2 other vehicles were there, a newer Honda CR-V with California plates and an older Ford Explorer with local Washington tags. Normal for a weekday morning in the off-season. I grabbed my pack, checked my radio, battery at full charge, and made sure my service weapon was secure in its holster. Standard protocol, even though I'd never had to draw it in 12 years of ranger work. The trail started innocuously enough. Douglas fir and western hemlock stretched overhead, their branches creating a natural cathedral that filtered the morning light into shifting green patterns on the forest floor. The sound of the Hoh River grew louder as I hiked deeper into the woods, following the same path Ethan had taken 8 months ago. My boots, Danner Mountain 600s, size 11, found good purchase on the damp earth, and I fell into the steady rhythm that every experienced hiker knows. After 45 minutes, I reached the river crossing where Margaret had witnessed the encounter. The water was running high from spring snowmelt, creating a constant white noise that would have made conversation difficult. I knelt beside the trail and pulled out my digital camera, documenting the scene just as I had during the original search. But something was different this time. There were footprints in the soft earth near the water's edge. Fresh ones. 2 sets, a man's hiking boots, size 10 or 11, and a woman's, smaller, maybe size 8. The prints were clear enough to show tread patterns, Merrill for the man, Keen for the woman. High-end hiking gear, consistent with experienced outdoors people. But what made my spine tingle was the 3rd set of prints, smaller and partially obscured by the others. They looked like they could have been made by the same type of boots Ethan had been wearing, Salomon X Ultra 3s, size 9. I photographed everything, using my iPhone 8 to capture GPS coordinates and timestamps. The phone's camera struggled in the filtered light, but I managed to get clear images of all 3 print sets. As I worked, a strange smell began to permeate the area. Something like ozone mixed with decay, as if lightning had struck very close by. But the sky overhead was clear, pale blue between the canopy gaps. The river crossing itself consisted of several large fallen logs that formed a natural bridge. During Ethan's disappearance, these logs had been slick with moisture and algae, making them treacherous to cross. Today they seemed somehow different, cleaner, as if they'd been recently scrubbed. I tested the stability of the first log with my boot, and it held firm. Ethan's research notes found in his car had indicated he planned to cross here to access an area of old-growth forest on the far side. I was halfway across when my radio crackled. Unit 12, this is dispatch. What's your 20? I keyed the mic clip to my shoulder. Dispatch Unit 12, I'm at the Hoh River crossing, coordinates previously logged. Investigating follow-up on the Davis case. Copy that, Unit 12. Be advised, we've had reports of unusual activity in that area. Hikers reporting strange noises at night. Strange noises. In my experience, that usually meant elk or coyotes, maybe a black bear making noise while foraging. But something in the dispatcher's voice suggested this was different. What kind of noises, dispatch? Singing, Unit 12. Human voices singing in a language nobody recognizes. I stopped mid-step on the log. Singing. That detail hadn't been in any of the original case files. How long has this been reported? Started about 3 weeks ago, always between midnight and 3 a.m. Rangers have responded twice but found nothing. 3 weeks ago was right around the time Margaret Chen had come forward with her witness statement. I filed that correlation away in my mental database and continued across the river. Copy, dispatch. We'll investigate and report back. If this story is giving you chills, smash that follow button for more supernatural horror. What would you do in Cole Anderson's situation? Comment below. On the far side of the river, the forest changed character dramatically. The trees were older here, massive Douglas firs and western red cedars that had been growing for centuries. Some were easily 6 feet in diameter, their bark furrowed with age, and their lower branches hung with old man's beard lichen that swayed in the breeze like funeral shrouds. The understory was different too. Less salmonberry and Oregon grape, more of the strange fungi that Ethan had been researching. I pulled out his research notebook, which had been returned to his family after the search. His handwriting was precise, academic, filled with Latin names and detailed observations about mycelial networks and soil chemistry. But the last entry, dated the day he disappeared, was different. The handwriting was hurried, almost frantic. Found them. The species doesn't match anything in the literature. The mushrooms seem to be growing in perfect geometric patterns, spirals and pentagons that couldn't occur naturally. The couple was right about this location. They knew exactly where to look. H&J know more about this ecosystem than any published research suggests. They keep talking about older sciences and deeper understandings, starting to think this discovery could rewrite our understanding of fungal biology. Meeting them at their cabin tonight to examine their samples. H&J. Harold and Janet Morrison, the helpful couple from Margaret's witness statement. Ethan had met them, trusted them enough to visit their cabin, but we'd never found any record of the Morrisons owning property in the area. I'd spent hours searching county records, property tax databases, even vacation rental listings. Nothing. I followed Ethan's GPS waypoints deeper into the old-growth forest, using the coordinates he'd marked in his notebook. The mushrooms he'd written about were still there, strange, pale fungi growing in those impossible geometric patterns. They seemed to pulse very slightly, though that could have been a trick of the shifting light. I knelt to examine them more closely and noticed that the soil around them felt warm to the touch, despite the cool air temperature. My thermometer read 42 degrees ambient, but the soil around the mushroom clusters registered 67 degrees. That was biologically impossible. Decomposition could create some heat, but nothing that dramatic. I collected soil samples in labeled bags, following the same protocols I'd learned in my biology degree before becoming a ranger. Whatever was happening here, it defied conventional understanding of forest ecology. The trail continued uphill through the old growth, becoming fainter and more difficult to follow. After another hour of hiking, I found something that made my blood run cold. A wooden sign, hand-carved and weather-beaten, that read, "Morrison Research Station, private property, visitors welcome." Below it, an arrow pointed toward a narrow path that wasn't marked on any official trail map. I checked my GPS coordinates. N47 deg 52 240.8, W123 degree 57 31.2. I was now 2.1 miles from the river crossing, deep in a section of national forest that was supposed to be undeveloped wilderness. No permits had been issued for any research stations in this area. I would have known. Permit reviews were part of my job responsibilities. The path was well maintained, with recent signs of foot traffic. I followed it for a quarter mile until the trees opened into a small clearing, dominated by a log cabin that looked like it had been there for decades. Solar panels on the roof, a small wind turbine, a neat garden area with more of those strange mushrooms growing in geometric patterns. Smoke rose from the chimney and I could see curtains in the windows. Someone was home. I approached cautiously, my hand instinctively resting on my radio. The cabin was well built, constructed from local cedar logs with professional craftsmanship. A wooden sign beside the door read H&J Morrison Field Research Station, Estier 1987. 31 years. They'd been operating here since before I was born, somehow completely off the radar of the National Park Service. Before I could knock, the door opened. A woman in her 60s stepped out, smiling warmly. She had gray hair pulled back in a practical ponytail, wore a fleece jacket and hiking pants, and looked exactly like someone's favorite college professor. Behind her, a man of similar age appeared, tall, bearded, with kind eyes behind wire-rimmed glasses. "You must be Ranger Anderson," the woman said, her voice carrying a slight accent I couldn't place. "We've been expecting you." The words hit me like ice water. I hadn't told anyone I was coming here. I hadn't even known this place existed until an hour ago. "Ma'am, I'm Cole Anderson with the National Park Service. I'm investigating the disappearance of Ethan Davis." "Of course you are," she replied. "I'm Janet Morrison, and this is my husband Harold. Please come in. We have a lot to discuss." Against every instinct screaming in my head, I followed them inside. The cabin's interior was like a natural history museum crossed with a graduate school laboratory. Specimen jars lined the walls, filled with fungi and plant samples I didn't recognize. Books in multiple languages covered every available surface, not just English and Spanish, but scripts that looked ancient and unidentifiable. Computer equipment hummed quietly in one corner, displaying data that scrolled too quickly for me to read. "Tea?" Harold asked, gesturing toward a seating area arranged around a massive stone fireplace. "It's a blend of local herbs, very restorative." "No, thank you." I remained standing, keeping my distance from both of them. "I need to ask you about your interaction with Ethan Davis on August 3rd of last year." Janet settled into a chair that looked hand-carved from a single piece of wood. Poor Ethan. Such a bright young man, so eager to understand the deeper mysteries of the forest. What happened to him? Harold joined his wife, moving with a fluid grace that seemed odd for a man his age. "He found what he was looking for, Ranger Anderson. The question is, are you prepared to find what you're looking for?" The temperature in the room seemed to drop 10 degrees. My breath began to mist slightly, even though the fire was crackling merrily in the hearth. "I'm looking for answers about a missing person. That's all." "No," Janet said softly. "That's not all. You're looking for the truth behind the disappearances. All of them. Ethan was just the most recent. All of them." She was talking about the other cases, the hikers and campers who'd vanished in this area over the past 3 decades. Cases that had been classified as accidents, animal attacks, or simple people getting lost in the wilderness. Cases I'd studied obsessively during long winter nights, looking for patterns nobody else wanted to see. "How many?" I asked. 47, Harold replied without hesitation. "Over 31 years, not counting Ethan, of course." 47 people. I'd only identified 23 cases that fit the pattern. "Where are they?" Janet smiled, and for the first time I noticed that her teeth were wrong somehow. Too white, too perfect, and arranged in a pattern that didn't look quite human. "They're exactly where they need to be, Ranger Anderson, serving a purpose far greater than anything they could have accomplished in their limited terrestrial existence." Terrestrial existence. The phrase sent chills down my spine that had nothing to do with the dropping temperature. I keyed my radio, trying to maintain contact with the outside world. "Dispatch Unit 12. I need backup at coordinates N47 degree 2, 4 Thornt 8, W123 degree 731.2. Static, dead static. Radio frequencies don't work properly here," Harold explained apologetically. "Something about the magnetic field variations. We've measured electromagnetic anomalies that suggest this area exists in a state of dimensional flux." Dimensional flux. These people were talking like scientists, using precise terminology, but describing impossible phenomena. I looked around the cabin again, really paying attention this time. The books weren't just in foreign languages. Some of them appeared to be bound in materials that weren't paper or leather. The computer screens showed data that hurt to look at directly, numbers and symbols that seemed to shift when I wasn't focusing on them. "You're not researchers," I said. "Of course we are," Janet replied. "Just not the kind you're familiar with. We study the intersection points where your reality touches much older, much larger realities. This forest sits on one of the most significant convergence zones in North America." "What does that mean?" Harold stood and walked to one of the bookcases, retrieving a leather-bound journal that looked ancient. "It means that the barriers between dimensions are thinner here. It means that entities from spaces far vaster than your universe occasionally take interest in what happens on this small planet. And it means that sometimes those entities require ambassadors. Ambassadors. Ethan. Ethan volunteered, Janet said, once he understood the magnitude of what we were offering him. The chance to transcend human limitations, to become part of something infinite and eternal. To serve purposes that span millions of years across distances your species can't even conceive. The room was definitely getting colder now, and the light from the fire was beginning to take on a strange quality, more purple than orange, casting shadows that moved independently of the flames. I could hear something now too, very faintly, singing. Human voices, but in harmonies that sounded wrong, using intervals that made my teeth ache. The singing, I said. Other rangers have heard it. The awakening ceremony, Harold explained. It takes time for human consciousness to adapt to non-Euclidean thought patterns. The singing helps with the transition. Non-Euclidean thought patterns. I was an educated man. I had degrees in biology and environmental science. But these concepts were beyond anything I'd encountered in academic literature. Yet somehow, on a level deeper than rational thought, I was beginning to understand what they were talking about. And that understanding was the most terrifying thing I'd ever experienced. You're saying Ethan is alive? Alive. Dead. These are terrestrial concepts, Janet said. Ethan exists in a state beyond such limitations. Would you like to see him? Every rational part of my mind screamed no. But I'd come here looking for answers, and they were offering me the ultimate answer. Yes. Harold opened the ancient journal to a page covered in symbols that seemed to writhe and shift on the paper. As he began to read aloud in a language that predated human speech, the temperature plummeted further. Frost began forming on the windows despite the fire, and the singing grew louder. Not from outside, but from somewhere above us, or below us, or from a direction that didn't exist in normal three-dimensional space. The air in the center of the room began to shimmer like heat waves rising from summer asphalt. But this was cold, so cold that my breath came out in thick clouds. The shimmer intensified, and I could see something taking shape within it. A human figure, but elongated, stretched across geometries that my eyes couldn't properly process. "Ethan?" I whispered. The figure turned toward me, and I saw his face, recognizable as the young man from the missing person photographs, but changed. His eyes held depths that seemed to contain galaxies. When he smiled, I could see that his teeth had been replaced with structures that looked like crystalline formations. When he spoke, his voice came from multiple directions at once. "Cole," he said, and the sound of my name spoken in that impossibly layered voice nearly drove me to my knees. "I've been waiting for you to understand. The universe is so much larger than we thought, so much older, so much more beautiful. What happened to you?" "I was chosen," Ethan replied, his form shifting slightly, becoming more translucent. "Just as you're being chosen now. The entities that exist in the spaces between spaces need representatives in your reality, ambassadors who can help prepare your species for the next phase of cosmic evolution. The next phase of cosmic evolution." The words hit me with the force of revelation, and suddenly I understood why I'd been drawn back to this case, why the folder had moved itself to the top of my drawer, why my radio had failed at exactly the right moment. This wasn't chance or coincidence. I was being recruited. "The other missing people," I said. "They're all serving," Harold confirmed, "across multiple dimensions, working to bridge the gap between human consciousness and cosmic awareness. It's the greatest honor any terrestrial being could hope for." The singing was becoming overwhelming now, a harmonic complexity that seemed to resonate in my bones. I could feel my perception starting to shift, reality becoming more fluid around the edges. The cabin's walls were beginning to look transparent, revealing glimpses of vast spaces beyond. Star fields that moved in impossible patterns, geometric structures that stretched across light years. "I need to leave," I said, but my voice sounded weak and uncertain even to my own ears. "Do you?" Janet asked. "Or do you need to finally stop running from the truth you've always sensed? You've spent your entire career studying the forest, cataloging its secrets, looking for patterns. You've always known there was something more, something your colleagues couldn't see. This is your chance to transcend the limitations of human understanding. She was right. Part of me had always known that the forest held secrets beyond conventional biology. The way certain clearings felt different, as if the air itself was charged with invisible energy. The way some trails seemed to loop back on themselves despite clear GPS readings. The way animals avoided specific areas without any apparent reason. "My family," I said, grasping for something to anchor me to normal reality. "My wife, my daughter." "We'll understand," Harold said gently. "In time. As humanity evolves toward cosmic consciousness, everyone will understand. Your sacrifice will help prepare the way for their eventual transcendence." The word sacrifice jolted me back to awareness. Not choice or opportunity. Sacrifice. I forced myself to look away from Ethan's transformed figure, to focus on concrete details. My watch read 2:47 p.m., but I'd entered the cabin just after noon. Either I'd lost track of time, or time itself was functioning differently here. I grabbed for my radio again, knowing it wouldn't work, but needing the familiar weight of it in my hand. "Dispatch, Unit 12, emergency backup requested." Nothing but static, but in that static, I thought I could hear voices, other rangers calling my name, searching for me. The real world was still out there, still trying to reach me. "Cole," Ethan said, his multi-layered voice becoming more insistent. "You have to choose now. The window is closing." "What window?" "The convergence," Janet explained. "It only occurs at specific intervals, when the dimensional barriers are at their thinnest. The next opportunity won't come for another 7 years. 7 years. I thought about my daughter, Emma, who was 6 years old and obsessed with butterflies. In 7 years, she'd be 13, a teenager dealing with high school and first crushes and all the normal crises of human adolescence. I thought about my wife, Sarah, who still left little notes in my lunch bag after 8 years of marriage. I thought about the ranger station, my colleagues who gave me grief about my obsessive research methods, but always had my back when things got dangerous. "I choose to go home," I said. The temperature in the room plummeted so suddenly that ice crystals began forming in the air. The singing became discordant, angry, filled with harmonies that made my ears ring and my vision blur. Harold's kind expression shifted into something that wasn't quite human, and Janet's perfect smile revealed teeth that were definitely not human. "That's unfortunate," Harold said, his voice now carrying overtones that seemed to come from somewhere deep underground. "We'd hoped you would make this choice willingly." "Willing participants adapt better to the transformation," Janet added. "But the entities we serve are not particularly concerned with human preferences." Ethan's figure was becoming more solid, and I could see that his transformation was far more extensive than I'd initially realized. His limbs had been elongated and jointed in ways that defied human anatomy. His skin had taken on a translucent quality that revealed structures underneath that might have been organs, or might have been something else entirely. "I'm sorry, Cole," he said, and there was genuine regret in that impossible voice. "But the work is too important. Humanity's evolution can't be delayed by individual resistance." I backed toward the door, but it wouldn't open. The handle turned, but the door itself seemed to be sealed by some force beyond normal physics. The windows showed only darkness now, despite the fact that it was mid-afternoon. We were no longer entirely in normal reality. "The process is actually quite beautiful," Janet said, rising from her chair with fluid movements that suggested her human appearance was entirely superficial. "Human consciousness expands to encompass cosmic awareness. Physical form adapts to function across multiple dimensional states. Pain is temporary, but the transcendence is eternal." I drew my service weapon, a Glock 22 that I'd qualified with every year for 12 years but never fired outside of training. The sight of it made Harold laugh, a sound like wind through dead trees. "Ballistics are largely irrelevant in non-Euclidean space," he said, "but if it makes you feel better, by all means." I aimed at the door instead of them, hoping that conventional physics still applied to some degree. The gunshot was impossibly loud in the confined space, but the bullet simply stopped in midair about 2 feet from the barrel, hanging suspended like it had hit invisible glass. Interesting, Janet observed. The projectile exists in a quantum superposition between kinetic and static states. Harold, are you recording this? They were studying me. Even as they prepared to transform me into something inhuman, they were treating it as a research opportunity. The clinical detachment in their voices was somehow more terrifying than open malevolence would have been. Ethan approached me, his elongated limbs moving with predatory grace. Don't fight it, Cole. I fought, and it just made the process more painful. Acceptance leads to enlightenment. I looked around the cabin desperately, searching for anything that might help. The books, the computers, the specimen jars. Everything here was wrong, existing in the spaces between normal reality and something far stranger. But there, on a shelf near the fireplace, I saw something that didn't belong. A standard National Park Service emergency beacon, the kind every ranger carried for true emergencies. You kept souvenirs, I said. Mementos, Harold corrected. Each transformation is unique. We document the process for the entities we serve. 47 mementos. 47 people who'd trusted these false good Samaritans and paid the ultimate price. I lunged for the beacon, knowing it was probably useless, but needing to try something. As my fingers closed around it, I felt a jolt of electricity that seemed to come from the device itself. The beacon was still connected to the normal world, still anchored in conventional reality. When I activated it, the emergency signal punched through whatever was distorting space around the cabin. Somewhere out there, real rangers with real radios would receive a GPS location and a distress call. The effect on the Morrisons was immediate and dramatic. They both screamed, not human sounds, but harmonics that shattered every piece of glass in the cabin. Their human appearances began to dissolve, revealing something underneath that my mind couldn't fully process. Geometries that existed in too many dimensions. Organic structures that followed mathematical principles beyond terrestrial biology. You have no idea what you've done, the thing that had been Janet said, its voice now coming from multiple mouths arranged in patterns that hurt to look at. The convergence cannot be interrupted. The entities will not tolerate interference. The cabin was coming apart around us, reality reasserting itself in waves that made the walls flicker between solid and transparent. Through the windows, I could see normal daylight returning, normal forest, normal physics. But the process was violent, chaotic, like two different universes trying to occupy the same space. Ethan's transformed figure was becoming unstable, his elongated form stretching and distorting as the dimensional barriers strengthened. "Cole," he called out, his voice fading across impossible distances. "Tell them I chose this. Tell them it was beautiful." The beacon in my hand was getting hot, its signal punching through realities that weren't meant to intersect. I could hear helicopters in the distance, search teams responding to the emergency call. The normal world was coming to find me. The last thing I saw before the cabin collapsed into itself was Harold and Janet, no longer human, no longer entirely present in our reality, looking at me with expressions that combined disappointment, respect, and something that might have been fear. "This isn't over," Harold said as his form dispersed into angles that existed in spaces between spaces. "The entities are patient. The convergence will come again." Then I was lying in a clearing full of normal trees under a normal sky, clutching an emergency beacon that was beeping steadily. My watch read 3:15 p.m. I'd been missing for 3 hours and 15 minutes, but it felt like days. The helicopter found me 20 minutes later. The search team included rangers I'd worked with for years, paramedics who checked me for injuries, even a psychologist who asked gentle questions about what I'd experienced. I told them I'd gotten lost, fallen, and hit my head, experienced some confusion and disorientation, standard wilderness emergency. But I kept Ethan's notebook, and I kept the soil samples I'd collected from around those impossible mushrooms. And late at night when my family was sleeping, I researched the things Harold and Janet had told me about dimensional convergences and cosmic entities and the evolution of human consciousness. The research led me to papers published in obscure journals by scientists who'd vanished shortly after their work appeared. It led me to mathematical proofs that described geometries beyond three-dimensional space. It led me to archaeological evidence of structures that shouldn't exist according to conventional history. It led me to the understanding that the Morrisons were telling the truth. 7 years. They'd said the next convergence wouldn't happen for 7 years. It's been 6 years and 11 months since I escaped that cabin that shouldn't exist. The missing person reports have stopped. No mysterious disappearances in Olympic National Park since Ethan Davis. But I know that's not because the entities have given up. It's because they're waiting. I've tried to warn people. I've filed reports that disappear from official databases. I've contacted researchers who stop returning my calls. I've reached out to families of the missing, only to discover that most of them have no memory of their lost relatives. Reality is being edited around the edges, prepared for something larger. My daughter Emma is 13 now, fascinated by quantum physics instead of butterflies. Sometimes I catch her staring at the sky with an expression of longing that terrifies me. My wife Sarah has started having dreams about vast spaces between stars, and she wakes up speaking in languages that don't exist. The convergence is coming, and I'm the only one who remembers why that should terrify us all. But I also remember Ethan's words, "Tell them it was beautiful." Part of me, the part that spent years studying patterns nobody else could see, searching for truths beyond conventional understanding, wonders if the Morrisons were offering genuine transcendence, if the cosmic entities they serve really are guiding humanity toward some form of evolution that our limited terrestrial consciousness can't comprehend. 7 years to decide whether I'll fight the convergence or surrender to it. 7 years to determine whether humanity's next evolutionary step is salvation or annihilation. 7 years to live with the knowledge that somewhere in the spaces between realities, 47 transformed humans are preparing the way for something that will change everything. I still carry that emergency beacon, just in case. But I'm not sure anymore whether I'll use it to call for rescue or to signal my surrender. Holy hell, that was intense. Did that ending blow your mind? Like, if you want more terrifying Ranger stories, follow for daily supernatural horror, and comment your theory about what really happened to Ethan Davis. I read every single one. My name is Will Carter, and at 6:47 a.m. my radio crackled with the call that would change my life forever. Unit 7, we have a code yellow at Cascade National Forest. Missing person, Connor O'Brien, 19 years old, last seen yesterday at 1:30 p.m. on the Devil's Backbone Trail. The voice of dispatch cut through the morning stillness of my ranger station like a blade through silk. I'd been sipping my third cup of black coffee, watching the sunrise paint the Douglas firs in shades of gold that reminded me of my daughter Emma's hair when she was 5. That memory would haunt me later, the innocence of it, the warmth that felt like a lifetime away from what I was about to discover. I grabbed my standard-issue Motorola radio, with hands that had steadied countless rescue operations over my 15 years in the service. Copy that. Dispatch. ETA to trailhead 15 minutes. Any additional details on the missing? My voice carried the practiced calm of a veteran who'd pulled dozens of lost hikers from these mountains. But something in my gut, that sixth sense you develop after years in the wilderness, whispered that this wouldn't be another routine search and rescue. Connor O'Brien, Caucasian male, 5'10", brown hair, blue eyes, last seen wearing a red REI hiking jacket, blue jeans, black Merrell boots. Family reported him overdue from a day hike at 11 p.m. last night. Mother she's pretty shaken up, Will. I could hear the weight in dispatcher Sarah's voice, the way she said the mother's name like she was handling something fragile and already cracked. The drive to Devil's Backbone Trailhead took me through the heart of Cascade's old growth section, where trees older than the Declaration of Independence stood like silent sentinels keeping watch over secrets buried deep in the forest floor. My F-150 Ranger truck hummed along the winding mountain road while my mind automatically cataloged the conditions. Temperature 42 degrees and rising, humidity 78%, wind from the northwest at 8 mph. Clear skies, but the weather service had issued warnings about a cold front moving in by evening. If Connor was injured and couldn't move, hypothermia would become a factor by midnight. As I pulled into the gravel parking area, I saw them immediately. The family cluster huddled around a silver Honda Civic with Washington plates, their faces carrying that particular strain of terror that comes when someone you love vanishes into the wilderness. Connor's mother, Patricia O'Brien, looked like she'd aged 10 years overnight, her graying hair disheveled and her green eyes red-rimmed from crying and caffeine. His father, Frank, stood with the rigid posture of a man fighting to maintain control while his world crumbled around him. The sight hit me harder than it should have. Emma was only 2 years younger than Connor, and the thought of her lost in these woods made my chest tighten, with a fear I hadn't felt since she was small enough to wander away at the grocery store. "Ranger Carter?" Patricia's voice broke as she approached, clutching a photo of Connor so tightly her knuckles had gone white. "Please, you have to find our boy. He's a good kid, responsible. He wouldn't just disappear." The photo showed a young man with an easy smile and his mother's green eyes, wearing a University of Washington sweatshirt. Normal. Innocent. The kind of kid who helped old ladies with their groceries and called his parents every Sunday. I took the photo with steady hands while my trained eyes scanned the trailhead area for any obvious signs. "When did you last speak with Connor, Mrs. O'Brien?" My voice carried the reassuring authority that families needed to hear, even as I noticed something that made my skin crawl. The absolute silence of the forest around us. No bird songs, no chittering squirrels, not even the buzz of insects that should have been abundant at this time of morning and season. Yesterday morning at breakfast, Frank O'Brien's voice was hoarse from calling his son's name through the night. He said he wanted to hike Devil's Backbone, maybe push up to Widow's Peak if he felt good. Connor's been hiking these mountains since he was 12. He knows them better than most. He had his GPS, emergency whistle, the whole kit. "Something's wrong, Ranger. Something's really wrong." I nodded, pulling out my handheld GPS unit and setting waypoints while mentally reviewing the Devil's Backbone trail system. It was a moderate difficulty loop, well marked and regularly maintained, with 3 emergency call boxes stationed along the route. The trail gained 2,400 feet of elevation over 8.2 miles, winding through dense forest, across 2 creek crossings, and up to a stunning overlook at Widow's Peak. In good conditions, an experienced hiker could complete it in 4 to 5 hours. But these mountains had their own agenda, and even veteran hikers could find themselves in life-threatening situations when weather turned, or when they made one small mistake that cascaded into disaster. "I'm going to find him," I promised, the words carrying more weight than I intended. Patricia O'Brien's face crumpled with relief and renewed tears, and I felt the familiar burden of a family's hope settling on my shoulders like a lead blanket. "I'll radio in every 30 minutes with updates. Stay here by the trailhead, and if Connor comes out on his own, call dispatch immediately." The first mile of Devil's Backbone Trail passed through second-growth forest, the path well-defined and marked with the familiar brown and yellow trail blazes that had guided thousands of hikers safely through these woods. My boots, worn Danner Acadias that had carried me through dozens of searches, found their rhythm on the packed earth trail, each step raising tiny puffs of dust that caught the morning sunlight filtering through the canopy. But with each step deeper into the forest, the wrongness I'd felt at the trailhead intensified, like walking into a house where you know someone has died, but can't yet smell the decay. At 8:15 a.m., I reached the first waypoint, a wooden bridge crossing Cascade Creek where the clear mountain water should have been babbling over moss-covered rocks. Instead, I found the creek running strangely quiet, its usual cheerful gurgle muted to an almost conspiratorial whisper. I knelt beside the water and noticed something that made my experienced tracker's instincts flare. Fresh boot prints in the soft earth beside the creek, size 10 or 11, with the distinctive tread pattern of Merrill hiking boots. Connor's boots, based on the description his parents had given me. But there was something else. Something that made me radio dispatch with hands that weren't quite as steady as they should have been. Unit 7 to base. I've got boot prints at the Cascade Creek crossing, consistent with our missing person. But Sarah, there's another set of prints here. Small ones. Like a child's feet, but... I paused, studying the impressions more carefully. These prints are too perfect, too deep for a child's weight, and they're following Connor's trail. The response crackled back through increasing static. Copy. Unit 7. Any sign of the missing person himself? Negative. Continuing search. We'll report at next waypoint. I clipped the radio back to my belt and stood, studying the trail ahead with eyes that had seen things in these mountains that most people wouldn't believe. The small footprints bothered me more than I wanted to admit, not just because they were anomalous, but because something about their perfectly preserved state in the soft earth suggested they'd been made recently. Very recently, like whoever or whatever made them was still nearby, watching me examine their trail. The second mile of trail climbed steadily through old-growth timber, where massive Douglas firs and western red cedars created a cathedral-like canopy that normally filled me with the peaceful reverence I'd felt since my first day as a ranger. Today, those same trees felt oppressive, their shadows deeper and more angular than they should have been, their massive trunks creating blind spots that my paranoia insisted were hiding something just out of sight. The temperature had dropped noticeably since the trailhead, despite the climbing sun, and I found myself checking my watch more frequently than necessary, a nervous habit I'd developed during the 3 searches where we'd found bodies instead of living people. At 9:30 a.m. I reached Connor's backpack. It sat propped against a large boulder beside the trail, positioned so perfectly upright that it looked like Connor had simply set it down for a rest break and would return any moment. But the pack was open, its contents spilled across the surrounding area with a randomness that suggested a struggle, or something worse. Connor's water bottles lay empty beside a granola bar that had been torn open and scattered, its contents mixing with pine needles and forest debris in a way that looked almost ritualistic. His emergency whistle hung from a nearby branch, swaying slightly in a breeze I couldn't feel, creating a tiny metallic chiming that sounded like wind chimes in a graveyard. I photographed everything with my department-issued digital camera before disturbing the scene, my training overriding the growing dread that was settling in my chest like a physical weight. Connor's wallet was still in the pack, along with his car keys and cell phone, a newer iPhone that should have had good battery life. When I powered it on, the screen showed 17 missed calls from Mom and 12 from Dad, each timestamp a marker of his family's growing panic as the hours stretched on without word. But it was what I found beneath Connor's scattered gear that made my hands shake as I keyed my radio. A child's doll, maybe 18 inches tall, with a porcelain face that had been beautiful once, but was now cracked down the middle with hairline fractures that created a spiderweb of damage across features that seemed to shift and change when I wasn't looking directly at them. The doll wore a faded blue dress that might have been pretty 50 years ago, before time and weather had turned it into something that belonged in a horror movie. Its eyes, glass marbles the color of stormy skies, seemed to track my movements with an intelligence that made my combat-trained instincts scream warnings I'd learned to trust during my tour in Afghanistan before I became a ranger. Unit 7 to base. Emergency priority. My voice was steadier than it had any right to be. I've located Connor O'Brien's backpack at coordinates 47.721 Wundigen, 121.1530 Wundig W, approximately 2.4 miles up Devil's Backbone Trail. Pack appears to have been disturbed. No sign of Connor, but Sarah, there's something else here. Something that doesn't belong. If this story is giving you chills, smash that follow button for more supernatural horror. What would you do in Will Carter's situation? Comment below. The static-filled response took longer than usual. Copy, Unit 7. Do you need backup? Sheriff's Department can have a team to your location in 45 minutes. I stared at the doll, which seemed to be staring back with an intensity that made my skin crawl. Every rational part of my brain insisted it was just porcelain and cloth, an old toy someone had lost or discarded years ago. But 15 years of experience in these mountains had taught me to trust my instincts, and my instincts were screaming that this thing was not just a doll. It was something else wearing a doll's shape. Something that had been waiting in these woods for the right person to find it. Something that had found Connor first. Negative on backup for now, I heard myself say, though I wasn't sure why I was declining help. I'm going to continue tracking. Connor's trail continues up the mountain. I'll call if I need assistance. As I spoke, a gust of wind moved through the forest. The first real breeze I'd felt all morning, and the doll's dress rustled with a sound like whispered secrets. When the wind died, I could have sworn the doll had shifted position slightly. Its head tilted at a different angle. Its cracked face turned more directly toward me. The rational part of my mind insisted it was just the wind, but the part of me that had survived combat and mountain rescues knew better than to dismiss the impossible when lives were at stake. I left the doll where I'd found it and continued up the trail, following Connor's boot prints and the increasingly strange small footprints that seemed to dance around his path like a child playing tag with someone much larger. But with each step away from the doll, I felt a crawling sensation between my shoulder blades, as if something was watching me retreat, as if something was following. The third mile of trail took me into terrain that should have been familiar. I'd hiked this section dozens of times during routine patrols and guided tours. But today, the landscape felt subtly wrong, as if someone had taken a photograph of the forest and altered it just enough to make me question my memory. Trees I remembered as straight seemed to lean at impossible angles. Rocks that should have been weathered gray appeared darker, their surfaces slick with moisture despite the dry morning air. The trail itself seemed to curve more sharply than it should, leading me deeper into shadows that felt too dense for the position of the sun overhead. At 10:45 a.m., I found Connor's hiking jacket. It hung from a low branch about 30 feet off the trail, the bright red REI logo like a beacon against the dark green of the forest. But Connor would never have wandered that far from the path, especially not to hang his jacket so carefully on a branch that required climbing to reach. The jacket hung with an almost ceremonial precision, its arms spread wide as if Connor had been crucified in fabric and left as a marker for anyone who might follow his trail. When I retrieved the jacket, I found it was completely dry despite the heavy dew that had soaked everything else in the forest. More disturbing, it smelled wrong, not like the familiar sense of hiking and honest sweat, but like something sweet and cloying, like flowers left too long in a vase until they began to rot. Inside the jacket's pockets, I found Connor's emergency supplies, energy bars, fire starting kit, basic first aid materials, everything a responsible hiker carries, abandoned like props in a play where the actor had simply walked off stage mid-performance. But it was what I found pinned to the inside of the jacket that made my blood run cold. A child's drawing, executed in crayon with the shaky hand of someone very young. The drawing showed a stick figure man standing beside a much smaller figure, a little girl in a blue dress with long dark hair, but the little girl's face had been scribbled over with black crayon until it was just a dark smudge, and red crayon had been used to draw lines extending from her stick figure hands toward the man. Lines that looked disturbingly like claws. At the bottom of the drawing, in the careful block letters of a child just learning to write, were the words, "Dolly wants to play." I photographed the drawing and the jacket before radioing my location to dispatch, but as I spoke into the radio, the static grew so intense that Sarah's responses became increasingly garbled. Unit 7, bzz. Losing you, bzz. Weather moving in faster, bzz. Back up en route. The transmission dissolved into white noise that sounded almost like children's laughter, high and sweet, and completely devoid of innocence. When I tried to call back, my radio was completely dead. The silence that followed was absolute. No static, no electrical hum, nothing but the oppressive quiet of a forest that had been holding its breath for hours. I checked my cell phone and found no signal, despite being in an area that usually had decent coverage. My GPS unit was still functioning, showing my coordinates and the route back to the trailhead, but the electronic compass was spinning wildly, unable to find magnetic north in a landscape that seemed to be actively fighting against navigation. I was officially alone in the wilderness with a missing person whose trail was leading deeper into territory that felt less like the mountains I'd served for 15 years, and more like the setting of every nightmare I'd had since childhood. But Connor O'Brien was somewhere ahead of me, and his parents were waiting at the trailhead with the kind of desperate hope that only family members can carry. So I continued climbing, following boot prints that seemed to be leading me towards something that was waiting in the heart of the forest. At 11:30 a.m., I heard Connor screaming. The sound came from somewhere higher up the mountain, beyond a ridge that blocked my view of the trail ahead. But it wasn't the scream of someone injured or lost. It was the scream of someone experiencing pure, absolute terror. The kind of fear that breaks something fundamental in the human psyche and leaves only animal panic behind. The scream cut through the morning air like a chainsaw through silk, then stopped so abruptly that the silence afterward felt like a physical blow. I ran. My 15 years of search and rescue training took over, my body moving up the steep trail with a desperate efficiency that burned my lungs and turned my legs to fire. Branches whipped across my face and tore at my uniform, but I barely felt them as I crashed through underbrush and scrambled over fallen logs, following the sound of that terrible scream like a beacon guiding me toward something I wasn't prepared to face. When I crested the ridge, I found Connor. He was standing in a small clearing about 50 yards ahead, his back to me, perfectly motionless. Still alive, apparently uninjured, but something about his posture, the absolute stillness, the way his head was tilted slightly to one side, made me stop running and approach with the caution I'd learned during my military service. Something was wrong with this picture, wrong in a way that made every survival instinct I possessed scream warnings. "Connor?" My voice carried clearly across the clearing, but he didn't respond, didn't turn around, didn't acknowledge my presence in any way. He just stood there, facing toward the far edge of the clearing where the forest grew thick and dark, his body rigid as a statue. "Connor, it's Ranger Carter. Your parents sent me to find you." As I got closer, I could see that Connor was trembling. Not the obvious shaking of someone cold or scared, but a fine, almost imperceptible vibration, like a guitar string held at perfect tension. His hands hung at his sides with fingers splayed wide, and I could see that his fingernails were bloody, as if he'd been clawing at something. When I circled around to see his face, my professional composure finally cracked. Connor's eyes were open, but they were completely white. Not rolled back, but white as if someone had filled them with milk. Tears of blood had dried on his cheeks in perfect vertical lines, and his mouth was open in a silent scream that matched the one I'd heard from the ridge. But most disturbing of all, he was completely motionless except for that subtle trembling, as if something else was controlling his body while his consciousness was trapped somewhere far away. "Jesus Christ," I whispered, reaching for my radio before remembering it was dead. "Connor, can you hear me? I'm going to get you out of here." When I touched his shoulder, two things happened simultaneously. Connor's head snapped toward me with inhuman speed, his milk-white eyes somehow focusing on my face despite their obvious blindness, and I heard a sound from the far edge of the clearing that made my blood freeze in my veins. It was the sound of a child giggling, high, sweet, and absolutely delighted with some private joke that I was only beginning to understand. That's when I saw the doll again. It was sitting on a fallen log at the far edge of the clearing, but it was no longer the same size it had been when I'd found it beside Connor's backpack. Now it was larger, maybe 3 feet tall, and it was moving. Not the jerky, mechanical movement of a wind-up toy, but the fluid, purposeful movement of something alive. As I watched in horrified fascination, it slid down from the log and began walking toward us with a gait that was almost normal, except for the way its porcelain head turned completely around to face us, while its body continued moving forward. The doll's cracked face had changed too. The spiderweb fractures had shifted and deepened, creating a pattern that looked disturbingly like a face beneath the face, something ancient and malevolent peering out through the broken porcelain. Its glass eyes had taken on a luminescent quality, glowing with an inner light that cast twisted shadows across its features. And when it smiled, when that crack-damaged porcelain face split into a grin that showed far too many teeth, I understood with crystal clarity that this thing had been waiting in these woods for years, maybe decades, collecting people who wandered too far from the safe, rational world. "Hello, Mr. Ranger," the doll said in a voice like breaking glass mixed with a little girl's laughter. "Dolly wants to play with you too." Connor began to scream again, but his body remained perfectly motionless except for his mouth, which opened and closed like a mechanical ventriloquist's dummy. The sound that emerged was pure anguish, the sound of someone experiencing horrors beyond human comprehension while being trapped inside their own body, forced to watch as something else pulled their strings. I did the only thing my training and instincts told me to do. I grabbed Connor under his arms and started dragging him backward, away from the approaching doll and toward what I hoped was the trail back to civilization. But Connor's body was completely rigid, his muscles locked in a state of supernatural paralysis that made him feel like I was trying to move a statue carved from flesh and bone. "You can't take him away," the doll said conversationally, its voice seeming to come from everywhere and nowhere at once. "He belongs to Dolly now. He's going to stay and play forever and ever." As it spoke, the doll began to move faster, its small legs carrying it across the clearing with a speed that defied physics and common sense. Behind me, I heard more giggling. Not just one voice, but several, as if the forest itself was laughing at my desperate attempt to save Connor from whatever this thing had done to him. When I glanced over my shoulder, I saw them. More dolls, dozens of them, emerging from behind trees and rocks and fallen logs. Some were small, like children's toys. Others were larger, nearly human-sized. All of them were moving with that same fluid, impossible grace, and all of them were watching me with eyes that glowed like phosphorus in the forest shadows. They weren't just dolls, I realized with a clarity that felt like ice water in my veins. They were people, or what was left of people who had wandered into these woods and been transformed by whatever ancient, hungry thing lived in the heart of this forest. Their porcelain faces were masks hiding the remnants of human consciousness, trapped forever in bodies that couldn't die but couldn't truly live. Connor's weight suddenly vanished from my arms as he stood up on his own, but his movements were wrong, too smooth, too coordinated, as if invisible strings were controlling his body. When he turned to face me, his milk-white eyes had taken on the same phosphorescent glow as the doll's, and his smile was too wide, stretching his lips until they cracked at the corners and began to bleed. "Don't be scared, Mr. Ranger," Connor said in a voice that was still his own but carried harmonics that sounded like breaking china. "It doesn't hurt after the first few minutes. Dolly makes it so you can't feel anything at all. You just watch and watch and watch while she plays with your body like a toy." The original doll, the one I'd found beside Connor's backpack, was now close enough that I could see the intricate details of its transformation. Its porcelain face was shifting like liquid, features flowing and changing as if something underneath was trying to break through. And in its eyes, I saw something that made me understand the true horror of what was happening. I saw Connor's consciousness, trapped behind glass marbles, screaming silently while his body betrayed him. That's when I did something that went against every principle of my training and every instinct I'd developed during 15 years of search and rescue operations. I turned and ran, leaving Connor standing in that clearing with the growing circle of dolls closing in around him like predators surrounding wounded prey. I ran through the forest with a desperation I hadn't felt since combat, crashing through underbrush and leaping over fallen logs with a speed born of pure terror. Behind me, I could hear them following, not just the dolls, but Connor too, his feet keeping perfect rhythm with the porcelain army as they gave chase through the trees. Their laughter echoed through the forest like wind chimes in a hurricane, sweet and musical and absolutely inhuman. My GPS unit was spinning wildly, unable to find coordinates in a landscape that seemed to be shifting around me like a living thing. Trees I had passed on the way up appeared in different locations, and the trail I had followed was nowhere to be found. I was lost in a forest I had known for 15 years, being hunted by things that should not exist in any rational universe. But then I remembered something from my military training, something my sergeant had taught us about navigation when electronic equipment failed. Follow water downhill, and it will always lead you to civilization. I could hear Cascade Creek somewhere to my left, its whispered flow barely audible above the sound of my own desperate breathing. I changed direction and crashed through the underbrush toward the sound of water, hoping that the normal laws of physics still applied to at least some parts of this nightmare forest. When I reached the creek, I found something that gave me the first real hope I'd felt since finding Connor's backpack. My own footprints in the soft earth beside the water, the same boot prints I'd made hours earlier when I was still following a missing person case instead of running for my life from an army of possessed dolls. The creek was flowing in the right direction, downhill toward the trailhead toward the parking lot where Connor's parents were waiting with the kind of desperate hope that I was about to destroy forever. I followed the creek downstream, staying in the shallow water to mask my trail and muffle the sound of my movement. Behind me, the laughter was growing fainter, but I could still hear it carried on the wind, like a promise that this wasn't over. The dolls might have lost my trail, but something told me they weren't giving up. They were just waiting, patient as only immortal things can be patient, for me to make another mistake. At 1:30 p.m., I stumbled out of the tree line and saw my truck in the parking area. Its familiar green and gold Forest Service colors like a beacon of sanity in a world that had gone completely insane. Patricia and Frank O'Brien rushed toward me with faces full of desperate hope. But that hope died when they saw my expression and realized I was alone. "Where's Connor?" Patricia's voice was barely a whisper, but it carried the weight of a mother's worst nightmare becoming reality. "Where's our boy?" I stood there in the afternoon sunlight, my uniform torn and bloody from my desperate flight through the forest, trying to find words that could possibly explain what I had witnessed in those woods. How do you tell parents that their son has been transformed into something else? How do you explain that the rational world they trust in has boundaries, and that their child has crossed beyond those boundaries into territory where different rules apply? I found evidence of Connor's presence on the trail, I heard myself say, falling back on the professional language that had carried me through other impossible situations. But Connor is still in the forest, and I don't think we're going to be able to bring him back. Frank O'Brien grabbed my shirt with hands that shook with grief and rage. "What the hell does that mean? Is he alive? Is our son alive?" I looked into the faces of Connor's parents and realized that some truths are too horrible to share, too impossible to believe, too destructive to the human psyche to ever speak aloud. So I lied with the compassion that comes from understanding that sometimes lies are the only mercy we can offer. "I don't know," I said, which was both completely true and utterly false. "I'm calling for a full search and rescue team. We're going to bring Connor home." But as I reached for my radio and found it mysteriously working again, as I called for backup and helicopters and search dogs, I kept my eyes fixed on the tree line where I could see small figures moving between the trunks like children playing hide and seek, watching, waiting. Patient as only things that have all the time in the world can be patient. That night, lying in my bed beside my sleeping wife with my daughter safe in her room down the hall, I stared at the ceiling and tried to convince myself that what I had experienced in the forest was some kind of hallucination, brought on by stress and altitude and the pressure of a desperate search. But when I closed my eyes, I could still see Connor's milk-white stare and hear the sound of porcelain feet moving through dead leaves. And somewhere in the darkness outside my window, I could swear I heard the distant sound of children laughing. 3 days later, the official search was called off. Connor O'Brien was declared missing, presumed dead, his case filed away with the dozens of other people who disappear in wilderness areas every year and are never found. His parents held a memorial service that I attended, but couldn't bear to stay for, standing in the back of the church while they celebrated the life of a young man whose consciousness was trapped in a porcelain prison somewhere in the heart of the forest. I put in for a transfer the following week. But sometimes on nights when the wind is just right and the moon is dark, I still hear them calling to me. The dolls. Connor. All the lost ones who have joined their eternal game of hide and seek in the woods where normal rules don't apply. They're patient, these things that were once human. They know that eventually I'll have to go back, because Connor O'Brien is still alive in there, trapped behind glass eyes in a body that isn't his own. And sometimes in my dreams, I can hear him screaming my name, begging me to come back and finish what I started, begging me to save him from the doll that wears his face. I wake up every morning knowing that someday I'll have to return to those woods. Not because I'm brave, but because leaving Connor there was the most cowardly thing I've ever done. And in the end, the only way to live with that kind of cowardice is to eventually face it. The doll is still waiting for me. I can feel it in the forest, patient and eternal, playing with its collection of human toys while it waits for the day when I'll be brave enough, or desperate enough to come back and join the game. And maybe, just maybe, find a way to set Connor free. But until that day comes, I carry the weight of what I saw in those woods. The knowledge that there are places in this world where the rational and the impossible meet and merge into something that destroys everything we think we know about the nature of reality. Places where children's toys become predators, where human consciousness can be trapped in porcelain prisons, where the only escape is to run and never look back. I am Will Carter, and I left a 19-year-old boy to a fate worse than death because I was too afraid to stay and fight for his soul. God help me, I'm still too afraid. But tomorrow, I might be brave enough to go back. The end. Holy hell, that was intense. Did that ending blow your mind? Like if you want more terrifying ranger stories, follow for daily supernatural horror, and comment your theory about what really happened to Connor O'Brien. I read every single one. My name is Tommy Briggs, and the broken voice of Kevin Walsh's mother on the phone still echoes in my head. Please, Ranger Briggs, she had sobbed at 11:47 p.m. on a Tuesday night in October 2018. You're our last hope. Everyone else has given up. They say Kevin, they say he's dead. But I know he's not. A mother knows, you understand? Please, just look one more time. I should have said no. Should have explained that after 2 weeks of intensive searching in the Washington Cascade Mountains, involving helicopters, tracking dogs, and over 100 volunteers, the chances of finding Kevin Walsh alive were statistically 0. At 23, Kevin was an experienced climber who knew these trails better than most rangers. If he had vanished without a trace, something was deeply wrong. But then I thought of my own Sarah, 8 years old, sleeping safe in her bed with her stuffed bear, and my wife Emma saying her nightly prayers. I thought about how I would feel if it were Sarah who was lost, and some ranger told me it was statistically unlikely to find her. I'll look, Mrs. Walsh, I said, hearing my own voice as if it came from someone else. Tomorrow at sunrise. What I didn't know then was that Kevin Walsh had disappeared in the exact same area where in 1966 a group of hippies had attempted to invoke what they called the Ancient One during a psychedelic drug ritual that ended with 3 deaths and 2 disappearances. The ranger station files mentioned only substance-related accidents, but retired Ranger Bill Hendricks had told me different stories when I was a rookie. Stories about things that shouldn't exist, trapped in places that shouldn't be found. I woke at 4:30 a.m. that Wednesday, kissed Emma's sleeping forehead and whispered, "I love you," like I always did. She mumbled something about being home for dinner, our little tradition. I checked on Sarah one last time, her angelic face illuminated by her unicorn nightlight, and felt that familiar stab of paternal love that motivated me to be the best ranger possible. My Garmin eTrex 30X showed 5:47 a.m. when I parked at the Lost Creek trailhead, coordinates 47.751 Lon Wadigan, 121.1 309 W. Temperature was 34 degree, with dense fog predicted for midday. My Kelty Red Cloud pack weighed exactly 31 pounds, water for 2 days, energy bars, first aid kit, survival knife, emergency sleeping bag, and my Motorola XPR 6580 radio. Base, this is Unit 17. I spoke into the radio at 6:15 a.m., my breath creating vapor in the cold air. Beginning independent search in Kevin Walsh LKP area. ETA return 1800 hours. Copy Unit 17, responded dispatcher Jessica's tired voice. Maintain contact every 2 hours. And Tommy, be careful out there. There was something in her voice, a hesitation I couldn't decipher. The trail started normal. My Danner Mountain 600 boots found solid purchase on the wet stones, and the familiar smell of Douglas firs and damp moss filled my lungs. But as I went deeper into the forest following the GPS coordinates of Kevin's last confirmed sighting, I began to notice wrongness. First, it was the birds, or rather, the absence of them. In 13 years as a ranger, I had never experienced such complete silence, not even the whisper of wind in the treetops. The air felt too thick, like I was breathing through wet cotton. At 8:23 a.m., I found the first anomaly. The trail simply changed. I was following a well-marked path I'd known for years, but suddenly the tree blazes were different. Instead of the traditional white diamond marks, there were symbols I couldn't identify, interlocking circles with lines that seemed to move when I looked directly at them. I checked my GPS. It still showed the correct coordinates, but the trail on screen didn't match what I was seeing. I shook the device thinking electronic interference, but it was functioning perfectly. That's when I received the first text from Emma. "Honey, I know you're working, but Sarah had a nightmare about you. Said you were in a dark place where Daddy couldn't get out. Please text me when you can. Love you." My throat tightened. Sarah had always been sensitive, but she'd never had specific nightmares about my work. "Base, Unit 17, I said into the radio. "Reporting normal position, continuing search." Static. I tried again. More static. I checked my phone. No signal, which was strange because this area normally had at least 2 bars of Verizon coverage. I kept walking, but the wrongness was intensifying. The trees seemed taller than they should be, their trunks twisting at angles that hurt my eyes. The sunlight filtering through the canopy had taken on a sickly green tint, and shadows fell in directions that defied the sun's position. At 9:45 a.m., I found Kevin's backpack. It was hanging from a tree branch about 15 feet off the ground, perfectly intact. No tears, no signs of struggle, just hanging there like someone had carefully placed it. My pulse spiked as I used my emergency rope to climb up and retrieve it. Inside, Kevin's wallet, his phone, battery completely drained despite being a nearly new iPhone X, energy bars, and a journal I'd never seen before. The journal's pages were filled with Kevin's handwriting, but the entries were dated from before he was born. October 15th, 1966. The circle is almost complete. We understand now that the barrier between worlds is thinnest here. The ancient one has been waiting so long. October 20th, 1966. Marcus says the incantation is working. The air tastes like copper and electricity. Something is coming through. October 25th, 1966. God help us, it's not what we thought. It's not enlightenment. It's hunger. It's been feeding on the ones who came before, growing stronger. The handwriting was definitely Kevin's, but the dates were impossible. My hands shook as I photographed each page with my phone, though the camera kept malfunctioning, showing distorted images that looked like they were taken underwater. If this story is giving you chills, smash that follow button for more supernatural horror. What would you do in Tommy Briggs' situation? Comment below. That's when I heard the voice. Tommy. It was Kevin's voice, but wrong somehow. Like his vocal cords had been rewired by something that didn't understand how human speech worked. The sound came from deeper in the forest, where the trees grew so thick that daylight couldn't penetrate. "Kevin?" I called back, my voice cracking. "Kevin, is that you?" "Tommy, help me." I followed the voice, my rational mind screaming that this was a trap while my heart pounded with the hope that maybe, just maybe, I could bring Kevin home alive. I thought of his mother's broken voice, of the promise I'd made. The deeper I went, the more reality began to slip. My Garmin started showing impossible coordinates, negative elevations, longitudes that didn't exist. The trees around me weren't just tall anymore. They stretched up into a sky that had turned the color of old blood. And in the distance, barely visible through the unnatural fog, I could see lights. Not electric lights, something older, wrong, pulsing with a rhythm that matched my heartbeat. "Tommy, I found it. The place where they opened the door." Kevin's voice was coming from the lights now, but underneath it I could hear something else. A sound like static, like the universe tearing at its seams. I received another text from Emma, though my phone showed no signal. "Sarah's fever is getting worse. She keeps saying Daddy is in the hungry place. Please come home." My legs felt like lead, but I kept walking toward the lights. The journal in my pack seemed to be getting heavier, and when I glanced at it again, more pages had appeared. Pages covered in symbols that hurt to look at directly, mathematical equations that described geometries that shouldn't exist. That's when I saw the clearing. It was perfectly circular, about 50 yards across, and the grass inside was dead. Not autumn dead, but wrong dead, like it had been drained of something more fundamental than life. In the center stood 7 stone pillars arranged in a heptagon, each one carved with the same writhing symbols I'd seen on the trees. And suspended between the pillars, held by threads of what looked like crystallized light, was Kevin Walsh. He was alive. I could see his chest rising and falling, but his eyes... Christ, his eyes were completely black, like someone had filled them with oil. His mouth was moving, forming words I couldn't hear, but I could feel them in my bones. ancient words that made my teeth ache and my vision blur. "Kevin." I ran toward the clearing but stopped dead when my foot touched the border. The world inverted. For a split second, I wasn't Tommy Briggs anymore. I was something vast and hungry, something that had been waiting since before humans learned to make fire. I felt the weight of eons, the bitter cold of spaces between stars, the gnawing hunger for something I couldn't name. I understood, in that moment of cosmic horror, that I was looking at reality from the perspective of the thing that had been imprisoned here in 1966. The demon wasn't a demon at all. It was something far worse, a fragment of consciousness from a universe where the laws of physics operated on principles that would shatter human sanity. It had been trying to expand its foothold in our reality for 52 years, feeding on anyone who wandered too close, growing stronger. And Kevin? Kevin wasn't being held prisoner. He was being converted, transformed into a conduit that would allow the entity to fully manifest in our world. I staggered backward, vomiting violently as my perspective snapped back to human scale. The wrongness of what I'd experienced made every cell in my body scream in protest. My phone buzzed with one final message from Emma. "Tommy, I don't know if this will reach you, but Sarah just woke up. She said to tell you that love is stronger than hungry places. Come home to us." That's when I remembered something my grandfather had told me before he died. He'd been a minister, and he'd always said that some kinds of darkness could only be fought with light. Not the light of flashlights or campfires, but the light that comes from love, from connection to other human souls. I thought of Sarah's laugh when I pushed her on the swing set, Emma's smile when I brought her coffee in bed on Sunday mornings, the way Kevin's mother had sounded on the phone, desperate, but still loving her son. The entity in the clearing sensed my thoughts and recoiled. Through Kevin's corrupted voice, it spoke in words that bypassed my ears and carved themselves directly into my brain. "You cannot comprehend what you oppose, small thing. Your species' capacity for love is nothing against the hunger of eternity." But I was already moving. I pulled out my emergency flare, the bright red military-grade kind we used for helicopter signals. As I lit it, the clearing erupted in chaos. The creature shrieked through Kevin's mouth, a sound like reality tearing, and the stone pillars began to crack. The flare's light wasn't defeating the entity. That would have been impossible, but it was disrupting its concentration, breaking its hold on our dimension just enough for me to act. I ran into the clearing, the flare held high, and grabbed Kevin's hand. The moment I touched him, I felt the entity's full attention turn on me, like the weight of a dying star. It tried to pull me into its perspective again, to show me the futility of human existence against the backdrop of infinite cosmic hunger. But I held on to one thought. I had promised to bring Kevin home. The crystallized light threads began to snap as Kevin's eyes flickered back to brown. For just a moment, he was himself again. "Tommy," he whispered, confused and terrified. "What? Where am I?" "You're coming home," I told him, and meant it. The entity's rage shook the ground beneath us, but the stone pillars were crumbling now, the geometric prison that had held it stable for 52 years, finally failing. As we ran from the clearing, I could hear it screaming behind us, not in anger, but in something worse. Fear. For the first time since 1966, it was afraid. We made it back to the trail just as the fog lifted. My radio crackled back to life, and my GPS started showing normal coordinates again. Kevin collapsed against a tree, shaking and confused, but alive and human. "Base, this is Unit 17. I gasped into the radio. "I have Kevin Walsh, requesting immediate medical evac at Lost Creek Trailhead. We're coming out." The helicopter reached us 45 minutes later. As the paramedics loaded Kevin onto a stretcher, he grabbed my arm with surprising strength. "It's not gone, Tommy," he whispered urgently. "I can still feel it. What we did, it only bought us time. It's going to try again, and next time it'll be ready for someone like you." I never told anyone the full story. The official report mentioned Kevin experiencing severe dehydration and hallucinations, requiring psychological evaluation, but expected to make a full recovery. The strange journal disappeared from evidence, and the clearing Well, when the follow-up team went to investigate my coordinates, they found nothing but normal forest. But sometimes late at night when I'm tucking Sarah into bed, she looks at me with those wise 8-year-old eyes and says, "Daddy, you saved someone from the hungry place, didn't you?" And I kiss her forehead and tell her that love is always stronger than darkness, hoping to God that I'm right. Because Kevin was correct about one thing. It's not gone. I can feel it out there sometimes, probing the edges of our reality, looking for another way in. The demon of 1966 is patient and it's learning, but so am I. And I've got Emma's love, Sarah's laughter, and the memory of Kevin's mother's grateful tears when her son came home. Some kinds of light, I've learned, never go out. Holy hell, that was intense. Did that ending blow your mind? Like, if you want more terrifying Ranger stories, follow for daily supernatural horror and comment your theory about what really happened to Kevin Walsh. I read every single one.